Resistance Management School on realagriculture.com is brought to you by CropLife Canada.
Jay Stroeve here with realagriculture.com, and we're here for another episode of the Resistance Management School. And I'm joined today by Kelly Turkington of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Lacombe. All right, so today we're going to talk kind of a 10,000 foot level on resistance.
Sure.
Let's start with the obvious question. How do diseases become resistant to fungicides?
Well, it's really a numbers game. So if you can imagine the field that we're standing in here right now, the billions or trillions, whatever it would be, of barley stem pieces, or could be wheat stems, or whatever crop, and some of those will harbor plant pathogens. So you have a population within the field, and most of the members of that population will be susceptible to the fungicide that you use. But unfortunately, there may be a very small percentage that have the genetic makeup that makes them either less sensitive or actually fully resistant to the fungicide product that you're using. So it's a numbers game, and what really drives that development of resistance or shift towards less sensitive types of the pathogen is the frequency of fungicide use. That's really the key factor. So the more frequently you use a fungicide and a particular mode of action, whether it's within a season and you do multiple applications, or if you're in a tight rotation and you're using applications repeatedly and frequently between growing seasons, what it's doing is it's selecting within that pathogen population within the field those members that have the genetic makeup that allow them to resist the fungicide.
All right, so that leads to my next question, which is what's the impact of fungicide resistance on a grower's ability to manage their crops?
Well, initially, really, a grower may not notice any issues in terms of product performance, but if you look at a few years of repeated use, eventually what they'll start to see is the fungicide doesn't seem to be performing as well as it has in the past. And the extreme would be that the fungus, the pathogen that you're trying to control, basically becomes completely insensitive to the fungicide that you're applying. So therefore you have very little, if any, control with that fungicide product.
All right, so we've seen resistance in some pulse crops. How is the state of fungicide resistance in crops across Western Canada here?
I think, from a broad perspective, we're not in a bad situation. Certainly, as you mentioned, the pulses, since the late 90s, early 2000s, we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts in terms of resistance to the strobilurin class of fungicides. But if you look at other crop types, the development of resistance has been somewhat slower, and probably the main driving factor there is related to the frequency of fungicide use. But we're starting to see that change. So we might see fungicide going down with the herbicide, but then you need to come back in and spray the upper canopy leaves for that key flag leaf protection, the penultimate leaf, and so on. Now, within the last 10 years or so, we're seeing a lot of routine application in terms of fusarium head blight in cereals. So you might put a fungicide on early and then come back in at head emergence, top up that leaf disease or rust control, and get some fusarium suppression. So you're seeing an increasing use of fungicides more frequently within a growing season and between growing seasons. And sometimes it's useful to look over the fence. So if we look to Europe, the UK, Ireland, and so on, Northern Ireland, they have had a longer history of fungicide resistance. And they're trying to manage that as best they can. Australia is somewhat behind Europe. Probably within the last 5 to 10 years, they're seeing shifts in sensitivity, whether it's the speckled leaf blotch pathogen, which is one of the septorias, or even things like the net form of net blotch. They're seeing shifts in sensitivity in Australia. We're not quite as far along. We've had some indications of reduced sensitivity in the net blotch pathogen to some older triazole chemistry, and even some of the strobilurins. So we're not in the same situation as Europe, but again, if we continue to use fungicides especially as our soil management practice or strategy, we're going to increase our risk that we'll start to see some of these fungicide resistant pathogens developing.
All right, so you're currently doing work on managing fungicide resistance in barley.
Yes, so we do a lot of work on fungicides. Right now, we've been involved in 2 sets of projects. An older project that finished here in 2016, looking at fungicide sensitivity and the net blotch pathogen, both the spot and the net form. Right now, we have a new project, and we've got a PhD student at the University of Alberta with Stephen Strauchhoff, and she's looking at fungicide sensitivity in the spot blotch pathogen, which is one of the other main leaf diseases. So it's important to assess the pathogens that you're dealing with, characterize them in terms of their virulent spectrum, in terms of host resistance, but more and more we also need to be looking at, do we see shifts in sensitivity to particular fungicide groups? And that's basically what we're doing. So certainly that's a component, and then some of the management practices that are available, they've been in place in Europe for a long time, so we can learn from what they're doing. And the key thing probably overall is to only use a fungicide when you absolutely need to. You know, where there's going to be a definite impact on yield and quality, and where you're going to see a definite economic benefit to using that product. If you have to use a fungicide, try to use it once during the growing season if possible. If you're using it more often, then look at rotating fungicide active ingredients, and probably more importantly, look at products that contain a mixture of different active ingredients, and that will greatly decrease the risk that you're going to select for fungicide resistant strains of the pathogen within your field.
All right, thanks a lot, Kelly.
Excellent.